Okay, we're going to start on the next section here in regards to the cardiovascular system, and let's talk first about the cardiovascular or cardiac anatomy, and just to sort of get a basis in regards to the heart, in regards to some of the structures of the heart, which will help us to understand a little bit about the physiology and things like that that's going to follow. When we talk about the cardiovascular system, though, I think there's something important to know. First of all, if you have any from term, you know this. If not, then hopefully you learn somewhere else. But when we look at the cardiovascular system, it's one continuous circuit with the heart being sort of like the central clearing point for everything. And what happens is when we look at the cardiovascular system, even though it's one large continuous circuit, in other words, if I start something one place, eventually it's going to get back to the same place after it goes to the whole system. What happens, it's a series of two minor circuits. Okay, the first circuit's called the pulmonary circuit, and this is where the right side of the heart, okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit. The right side of the heart takes blood that's basically deoxygenated. A lot of the oxygen has been removed in the tissues and moves it to the lungs. In the lungs, the blood then will pick up oxygen, get rid of carbon dioxide, which is a waste product, and then go back to the left side of the heart. And that's what's called the pulmonary circuit. It's basically for a gas exchange between the lungs and the blood. Get rid of the waste product, carbon dioxide, pick up oxygen as a nutrient. When it gets back to the left side of the heart, then the blood leaves the left side of the heart and goes to the rest of the body. At that point, it's for nutrient, waste, and gas exchange between the blood and the tissues. In other words, it's taken all the nutrients that have been absorbed and stuff like that through the GI tract as well as the oxygen, takes it out to all the cells so the cells could use it. Obviously, the cells that have been using that stuff make waste products. They put the waste product back into the blood, which are either things that are eventually going to be eliminated through the kidneys, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the year, or carbon dioxide is a waste gas that could be eliminated in the lungs. And then from the rest of the body, it comes back to the right side of the heart and then goes to the pulmonary circuit again. Then from the pulmonary circuit, then it goes to the systemic circuit, then to the pulmonary circuit, the systemic circuit, and you see how that goes around and around and around. So it's a complete circuit with the heart is basically functioning only as the pump. It's the place in the middle that's the pump. It's the pump that keeps the blood moving that way. Now, a couple words that we have to make sure that we get before we get any further here are arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries are blood vessels that take blood away from the heart, or if we go back to the term efferent, they move blood away from the heart. So if blood's moving away from the heart, they're called arteries. And I'll talk a little bit later about the consistency, what an artery really is like. So they're efferent, they carry blood away from the heart. As they get further and further away from the heart, the arteries that are close to the heart have a elastic wall. Okay, they have 3 layers in it, but they have an elastic wall, and the elastic wall allows them to stretch a little bit. And that's what we feel when we feel a pulse. However, when we get closer to where we want to deliver the material, we lose a lot of that elasticity, and that's replaced by small muscles. And at that point, what happens, they stop becoming arteries and they become what are called arterioles. Arterioles are able to change in size depending upon where I want the blood to go. So finally I go from larger arteries to much smaller microscopic arterioles, which are basically will divert blood where it needs to go. If I don't need the blood to go somewhere, the arterioles will constrict down. If I need more blood, the arterioles will relax and will provide more blood. Finally, what happens is I'm going to jump down to the one on the bottom of the sheet here, which is the capillaries. Capillaries are small microscopic vessels. Sometimes if you actually see that, it's like the size, maybe the distance across, maybe about 6 or 8 microns across. And as a result, sometimes you see red blood cells like in a line, just doing a conga line down or a bunny hop line or something like that down the capillary because they're that small. But what happens, the walls in the capillaries are very thin, and as a result what happens is nutrients and oxygen could get out of the capillaries through the walls and through small little pores or slits in the walls, and waste products that are in the tissues now can go through the walls from the outside into the capillaries to be taken back to the heart, to be either taken to the kidneys to eliminate or to be taken to the lungs to change for gases. And that's what so capillaries are called exchange vessels. We don't have exchange between nutrients and waste anywhere else other than the capillaries. So the body has a large capillary bed, large number of capillaries in the body where this exchange occurs. So now that I've delivered my nutrients, my goods, okay, at the tissues, picked up waste, I have to get back to the heart. What brings blood back to the heart are things called veins. Veins will bring blood back to the heart, and they are therefore afferent. Afferent meaning bringing back too, so they carry blood back to the heart. Once I leave the capillaries, I have very small veins, and these very small veins are called venules, okay? And they will eventually get larger to become veins. Now, veins are very thin-walled. They're very saccular. They can actually stretch a lot. In other words, if you get a piece of like a roast or something like that, if you see a very solid round tube, it's an artery. It has elastic wall. But if I see an area next to it that has a very flat tube, very thin wall, it's probably a vein, okay? And veins are bringing the blood back to the heart. From the lower part of the body, it gets back to the heart, to the right side of the heart, by what we call the inferior vena cava. From the upper part of the body, it comes back to the heart, to the right side of the heart, the right atrium, through the superior vena cava. So we need to know the difference between the circuits, pulmonary versus systemic, so make sure you know that before you press on. And we need to know that arteries are vessels that take blood away from the heart, and then veins are vessels that bring blood back to the heart, and between the arterial system and the venous system are these small capillaries, which are exchange vessels. And I think that's all important to know, okay? Now the heart, really, the thing about it is, like, the major purpose of the heart, it's a pump, okay? And that's its purpose. It's a pump to be able to move the blood. If I ask people what was their first impression of the heart, they said, it's smaller than I thought. The heart's basically about the size of a fist. It's a lot smaller than what you would expect. Inside that heart, there are 4 chambers. The upper chambers and near the top of the heart, and the top of the heart we call the base. The wider part of the heart at the top is called the base. On the right side and the left side, I have what's called a right atrium and a left atrium. The right atrium on the right side, left atrium on the left side. They're very thin-walled, and they're receiving chambers. They're able to stretch a lot, so whatever blood comes back to them, they can accommodate the amount of blood that's coming back to them. So they are the receiving chambers. That's all they are. They're a temporary holding place, just like when you go into a building, you go into the atrium before you go into an office or something like that. And the atrium is sort of a receiving area, and they're at the top side of the heart, right atrium and left atrium. On the bottom of the heart, I have ventricles. Ventricles are larger pumping chambers. They're muscular walls. The right ventricle is going to have to pump blood from the right side of the heart to the lungs. The pressure is not that great, so I don't need that much of a muscle wall. There's muscle, but not as much muscle as I find in the left side of the heart. Left side of the heart has to pump the blood to the rest of the body, has to pump a long way under a higher pressure, needs to be a stronger force to move that blood through the whole body, and that would be the left ventricle. So I have 4 chambers: right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. Atria, receiving chambers. Ventricles are pumping chambers, okay? And basically what we're seeing up in here, this is the image on the right, the top one is basically looking at the front of the heart, and you see that little blue thing that says right atrium, and you see right ventricle, you see left ventricle, and the left atrium is sort of tucked behind that bluish vessel, which is actually the left pulmonary artery, which we'll talk about later on. The image on the bottom is basically the posterior aspect of the heart, and you see the left ventricle, right ventricle, and now you see more of the left atrium and a little of the right atrium, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about those individually, okay? Again, when we know where the heart is, first of all, it's in the anterior chest wall. We know that it's in that area called the mediastinum. It's in the mediastinum. It's posterior to the sternum and slightly to the left. So if I look, and let me try to get my camera down here, the heart doesn't sit right in the middle, but it's actually pointed. Now it's going to look a little bit different on the video. It's pointed a little bit. This is my left side over here. It's pointed a little bit to the left, okay? Also, we also find that it's actually tipped a little forward, so the bottom, or the point, and that pointy area we call the apex. The flat area at the top is the base. The pointer at the bottom is called the apex. The apex is tipped a little bit more towards the chest wall, and also it's rotated. The right side is rotated more in front, and the left side is rotated more behind. So it's not this way, not perfectly vertical, but shifted a little bit to the left, shifted a little bit forward, and rotated around, with the right side being more anterior and the left side being more posterior, okay? And what happens is, at this point, that's the way the heart sits. In fact, if you want to go home tonight, forgive me, you are home. But if you actually get a chance, if you lean forward, if you have a very thin chest wall, and feel straight down the mid-clavicular area, right here between about the 4th and 5th rib, and lean forward, you might feel the tapping of the apex of the heart against the chest wall, because it's that close, okay? At the top of the heart, we said it was called the base, and that's where all the great vessels come out. The aorta comes out of there. The pulmonary arteries come out of there. The pulmonary veins come back into the left atrium up on the top, and the inferior and superior vena cava come into the right atrium at the top, at the area of the base. So the top of the heart, near the top, where it's flatter, is called the base. The inferior portion is called the apex. Okay, and that's going to be important when we talk about contraction, how the muscle contracts a little bit later. Okay, we know that what happens is inside, it sits inside that mediastinum, or that center area of the chest, which also has, like, besides the heart, has the thymus, has the esophagus, the trachea, all the great vessels, and stuff like that that are inside this mediastinum. But we also know that inside that mediastinum, besides the heart, at least the lower 2/3 to 3/4 of the heart, is surrounded in another little sac, and that little sac that we've seen before is called the pericardium. It's a sac, and I'll talk a little bit more about the pericardium in just a second here. Okay, so basically that's what we see. You know, the top area near the top where all the vessels are coming off, that would be the base. The area that's right close to the diaphragm is called the apex. That's where the ventricles are on the bottom, where the apex is, and the atria are near the top. Okay, so that's what we see in this individual image here. Now, I mentioned a couple seconds ago that the heart is surrounded by a sac. Now, that sac is there for a purpose. What happens is, I want the heart, if you think about it, the heart has to keep on moving, okay? And it's better if it's not stuck to anything. I need it to be not stuck for the beating parts, which is basically the ventricles and the atria have to fill. So what happens is the heart is in this little sac that's around it, which is called the pericardium. Peri means around, cardi means heart, okay? And basically the sac is made because it's a two-layered membrane, okay? We talked about that a little bit with the lungs in regards to, cavities of the chest and stuff like that. What happens is on the surface of the heart, there's what's called the visceral pericardium. If I see the word visceral, it means organ. So on the surface of the heart, there's a membrane, and that's called the epicardium. Epi means upon. And what happens is that epicardium folds back on itself and creates a denser outer sac, which is called the parietal pericardium, which is the outer sac. And between those two walls, between the visceral pericardium and where it folds back on itself, like if I took a rubber glove and it's filled with air and tied the end, put my hands in, that's how the heart sits inside that sac. And then where the air would be filled with fluid. This sac is called the pericardial sac, and the pericardial sac is filled with about, it's filled with fluid. And that fluid's sort of a lubricant, so that when the heart beats, it's not sticking to anything. It's sort of hanging there. It's able to move, okay? It's not floating, okay? It's held up by the great vessels, which are on the top, because they're stuck to the backside of the abdominal wall. But what happens is the heart is able to beat, and it's not stuck to anything. And so that's what the pericardium does. It's sort of like a neat little organ. What happens is sometimes that pericardium becomes inflamed and we get too much fluid. And when the too much fluid, the outer sac, which is the parietal pericardium, is dense, okay, is firm. It doesn't stretch as much. And as a result, when they get a lot of fluid in there, instead of the parietal pericardium gets to its outer limit where it can't stretch anymore and starts to squeeze the heart, which causes a problem. That's called a pericarditis. Okay, and again, this is what we'd see with that sac. On the surface of the heart would be the visceral pericardium, and then around the outside would be the parietal pericardium with that space, which would be called the pericardial space with the pericardial fluid. And you see where it's sort of like outlines. You see where the great vessels are, how from that point on down, that's where the pericardial sac would be. Okay, so that's what that little image will show you there. The heart itself, okay, whoops, I don't want to do that. Oh man. Okay, the heart itself, it just has a couple ways that it goes. Let me see if I can go backwards. Up one, let me go backwards. When we talk about the heart itself, let me go see where we were on that thing I missed. The heart. We're talking a little about the walls of the heart on this particular slide. So if you go back, you'll be able to see that on the regular PowerPoint. But when we talk about the heart, the atria, like I said, are receiving chambers. And what we see is up on the top, they're like a purple on the side. You see it says right atrium, and you see the inside where it says left atrium. Because they're receiving chambers, the walls have to be relatively thin. They're very thin muscular walls. They are muscular, and they're able to expand a little bit because they are thin. They're a little bit more stretchable, okay? And then what happens is also on the right atrium and the left atrium, there's a flap. And what happens if I have a lot of blood that's going to come in, that flap could open, and it allows more blood when it comes back into the atrium to expand that flap a little bit more, okay? And that little flap is called the auricle. It's sort of like when you go on vacation, you take a suitcase, but it's expandable. So you take some stuff and you get a lot of souvenirs or buy extra t-shirts or a hoodie or something like that, and you don't have room in your suitcase, you unzip it, open it up, and that's like sort of like that auricle, that area of the flap of the atrium that could open up, okay? The ventricles. The ventricles, if we see right right here in this cross section have much more muscle in the walls. And if I look at the right ventricle, which is on the left side of the screen, and the left ventricle, which is on the right side of the screen right here, you can see that there's a little bit of a difference. The left ventricle has much thicker muscular walls, and the reason why, again, it has to pump that blood a longer distance and under higher pressure. The right ventricle has thinner muscular walls, and therefore it has to pump the blood a shorter distance, plus the blood pressure in the lungs is significantly lower. Okay, much lower, probably about 1/6, the way I find, to less than that for the rest of the body. It's a much lower pressure, so the muscle doesn't have to be nearly as strong on the right as it does on the left. Okay, and so that's what we see with that. So atria, thin walls, are able to expand with an auricle expansion. They're able to accept more blood because the blood is coming back to the atrium, and then it goes into the ventricles, and the ventricles have to pump it out. So the ventricles have more muscular walls. The right ventricle has thinner muscle walls. Left ventricle has thicker because it has a greater requirement to pump that blood a longer distance and at a higher pressure on the left side as compared to the right. And that's what we see in that. Okay, between the atria and the ventricles, there's what's called a sulcus. Okay, it's a coronary sulcus that goes all the way around, and some of the coronary arteries, which I'll talk about in just a minute, are in that sulcus there. Also, between the right ventricle and the left ventricle, there's also a groove. Okay, it's called the interventricular sulcus. Okay, and that interventricular sulcus will sort of like it's not really a very abrupt, but it's sort of like a shallow, hollowed out area, which is basically where some of my coronary arteries will come down from that ring of coronary arteries that go in the sulcus down towards the apex of the heart. And I'll show you that. They'll become a little bit more apparent in a couple minutes. Okay, so that's what we see in regards to the heart anatomy itself. Okay, now if I talk a little about the muscle wall. Okay, the heart wall has 3 layers. Okay, the outer layer is that membrane, and that membrane is called the epicardium. And the epicardium is a very thin membrane that covers the outside of the muscle wall. And basically, it's called the visceral pericardium. Just lines the outside of the heart. The muscle that we have in the actual wall is called the myocardium. And again, left thicker, right thinner. And the atria is a thin muscular wall, but that's called the myocardium. Okay, the muscular walls of the heart is called the myocardium, because myo, we know, means muscle. Inside the heart, the inside lining of the heart is covered with a membrane that's sort of like a slippery or a smooth membrane on the inside, and that's called the endocardium. The endocardium. Some people, when they have certain bacterial infections like strep throat, the strep, if it's not killed, goes to the endocardium, and it loves the endocardium. It embeds itself in the endocardium and causes a damage, which is called endocarditis, which in the past used to be universally fatal before we had antibiotics, but now we get treated with antibiotics, but high dose IV antibiotics to be able to take that. So I have the epicardium, which is the membrane on the outside, the myocardium, which is the muscle portion, and the endocardium, which is a membrane on the inside of the heart, which lines and creates a smooth. It's smooth, so it allows the blood to not bubble over everything, or like a creek with a lot of rocks is bubbling over. There are some irregularities in the heart, particularly in the ventricle. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And if I'm looking at this image up in here, you can see that on the left side would be the area of the endocardium. The outside we have the epicardium, and that big muscular area in the middle is called the myocardium. Okay. Muscle cells. We've talked about muscle cells before, and I really didn't want to mention much about this, but we know that what happens is the muscle cell is striated, just like we found with skeletal muscle, but instead of being a cylindrical type thing, it branches off. It has a couple branches off that, okay? And that allows interlocking membranes between that muscle cell and more muscle cells next to it, okay? And it allows a better generation of force from cell to cell and contraction from cell to cell. So the idea is I want this heart to be a little bit more efficient than skeletal muscle, and it allows that by being able to move these action potentials or the electrical currents from one cell to the other cell a lot more efficiently, okay? And what happens is and we saw this in the lab, is where one cardiac muscle cell meets another cardiac muscle cell, there's a little area inside there which is called an intercalated disc. We talked about that. These cells, there's a single nucleus, there are multiple branches, and they have these intercalated discs, okay? And basically, this is what we're seeing. If you look at the upper left picture, you can see that's striated, like it looked like skeletal muscle. However, when I look at that, you see how it branches off. There's a couple branches of that, and you see that intercalated disc, an area where one cardiac muscle cell contacts another cardiac muscle cell, and because there's branches of the cardiac muscle cell, it could contact a lot of different cardiac muscle cells in the meantime. Okay, and those are called intercalated discs. Okay, and again, it works very much the same way with the actin and myosin, very much, which gives it that striated appearance, just like we talked about. And this is just another little thing, and you can read this over on your own leisure about the size of a cardiac muscle. Again, cardiac muscle usually only has one nucleus, okay, as compared to multiple nuclei in skeletal muscle. The blood supply is very extensive. Why? Because it's firing all the time. It's always contracting, not a little contraction, but a significant contraction all the time. So it needs a very extensive blood supply to be able to provide oxygen and nutrients to that area. The contractions are basically twitches, and we'll talk about those not in this video, but one that's going to come up a little bit later, and with refractory periods, where a little short rest period. Those short rest periods between the contractions are important. Why? Because I have to have a chamber filled before it could pump. So in other words, to be able to pump, it has to have some blood in it. To be able to get the blood, it has to relax. It has to rest a little bit before it could pump the blood out. We'll talk more about that in an upcoming video. Stimulus is basically autorhythmicity, which means that the heart, if I took the heart out of the body and stuck it on a table for a period of time, it would continue to pump. If you don't believe me, watch what was it, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, where that guy reaches in the chest and the priest pulls out the heart is boom 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 boom. But so it's able to beat because it has certain cells, and I'll talk about those in a later video as to why that happens. Okay, and it has the intercellular connection where it branches off with the intercalated disc, like we talked about before. You could read over a little bit more of that for if you're more interested. The heart chambers. Okay, when we talk about the heart chambers, again, the atria are receiving chambers. Blood comes back to the heart afferently by veins back to the atria. They're receiving chambers. The ventricles, like I mentioned, are pumping chambers. Okay, and they pump the blood out. The right atria is separated from the left atria by what we call an interatrial septum, which is a wall. If you see the word septum, septum means wall. So there's a wall between the right atrium and the left atrium. Okay, now to get blood from the atrium into the ventricles, it goes through a valve. It's like a doorway. Okay, there's a doorway that allows blood to go from the atrium into the ventricles. When I don't want the blood to go through, these valves are closed. When I want the blood to go through, the valves become open. And they're called atrioventricular valves, because atrial, they're from the atria to allow into the ventricular valves. Okay, so they're between the atria and the ventricles. So what the valve is only to allow blood to go in one direction. In other words, when the blood goes from the left atrium into the left ventricle, when the left ventricle contracts, I don't want blood to go back up into the left atrium. I want the blood to go out that artery called the aorta. Okay, now between the right atrium and the right ventricle, the valve has three leaflets, and it's called the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve. Cus means leaflet. Okay, tricuspid valve. The valve between the left atria and the left ventricle has two leaflets, and that leaflet is called the bicuspid valve, or also better known as the mitral valve. It looks like the Pope or the bishop's hat that has two leaflets on it, which is called a mitre. Okay, and basically it has two leaflets, or called the bicuspid or mitral valve. Okay, so that's what we see between the atria and the ventricles. Tricuspid valve between the right atrium and right ventricle, bicuspid mitral valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And it basically, this image here shows, if we look on the left hand side of that image, you see the tricuspid valve. One of the cusps has been removed, but you can see how the blood's going to go. It's going to come back to the right atrium and it goes through the tricuspid valve, and then it eventually closes when the right ventricle contracts. If we look on the right side of this image, you can see where the left atrium goes through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle, and when the left ventricle contracts, the bicuspid mitral valve closes, so blood then could go out through the aorta, and I'll show you that in a little bit. Okay, look at the let's look at this. The ventricles, again, much thicker walls, and I've sort of messed that one up again. The ventricles are much thicker walls, like we talked about, and again, the left ventricle, if you look at it, has a much thicker wall than the right ventricle, simply because it has to pump longer. Okay, and so let's talk a little bit more about each individual chambers. right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. The right atrium gets blood that comes back to it from the circulation, from the head, the arms, the legs, the abdomen, everywhere in the body, except from the area around these little air sacs in the lung, okay? But from the rest of the body, even from the heart, the blood from the heart comes back to the right atrium. Even the blood that supplies the tissues of the lungs goes back to the right atrium, okay? So it enters from the systemic circulation by what's called the inferior or superior vena cava. Vena cava is a large vein. The one below the heart that comes from the bottom of the body is the inferior vena cava. The one that comes from the top of the heart is the superior vena cava. So the superior vena cava takes all the used blood from the head, the neck, the upper limbs, and the chest and brings it back to the right atrium. And just opposite in the right atrium is the inferior vena cava, which comes up from the rest of the trunk, the viscera, the abdominal organs, the lower limbs, to bring the blood back up into the right atrium, okay? We also find that the heart muscle needs its own blood supply, which is by what we call the coronary arteries. But around the heart, there are what are called the coronary veins, and the coronary veins also have an opening into the right atrium called the coronary sinus. Now, one interesting thing about the right atrium is before birth, since the fetus in utero doesn't need oxygen, I don't need to send blood to the lungs for oxygenation. So instead of, I know when the blood goes from the right side of the heart, it goes to the lungs to pick up oxygen, and it comes back to the left side of the heart. So the body says, do I really need to send all that blood to the lungs? The lungs aren't working. This fetus isn't breathing. You know, it's getting its oxygen from the placenta from the mom. So basically, in the fetus, there's an opening or a hole between the right atrium and the left atrium, and that hole is called the foramen ovale. Foramen ovale. Ovale, oval, foramen, hole. Okay, that allows when the blood from in the fetus comes back to the right side of the heart, it doesn't all have to go out to the lungs, but some of it will actually, a good portion of it will go from the right atrium artificially into the left atrium, and then could be pumped to the rest of the body, because then from the left atrium it goes to the left ventricle to the rest of the body. So it bypasses the lungs, okay? What happens though is after birth, this foramen ovale naturally just closes very shortly after birth. And as a result, it closes that window between the right atrium and the left atrium, okay, to allow blood to go its normal way from the right atrium to the right ventricle out to the pulmonary arteries to the lungs and stuff like that, instead of from the right atrium into the left atrium to the left ventricle and out through the aorta. It allows the normal way, right atrium to the right ventricle and out to the lungs. And what happens is, if you look at the heart, there'll be a small ditch where this foramen ovale closed, and it leaves sort of a remnant, and that remnant would be called the fossa ovalis. The fossa ovalis, because it's basically like a little ditch. We all know what a fossa is. So if I look at this picture, you can see the right atrium. So zero in on the right atrium, and you can see the superior vena cava coming from the top into the right atrium, and you see the inferior vena cava coming from the bottom, going up to the right atrium from below. Okay, and also you see sort of like in the middle. Between the two, there's a little hole, which is the opening of the coronary sinus, where the venous blood from the heart will actually drain right into the right atrium, like there. And then you can actually see sort of like a depression, and it's pointed out as the fossa ovalis, which is where the foramen ovalis was, which was the opening between the right atrium and the left atrium, and that's now closed after birth. If it doesn't close, sometimes they have to go in and surgically close it, put a patch in there, and surgically close it shortly after birth if it causes problems. Okay, but usually, you know, the vast majority of the time, it just closes right after birth. Okay, so that's the right atrium, and that's the right atrium. The right ventricle. Okay, if I look at the right ventricle gets the blood from the right atrium. So once the blood is in the right atrium, it's come from the body, it goes in the right ventricle, because the right atrium is not good enough to pump it out. I have to go somewhere else. It goes into the right ventricle. So the blood goes from into the right ventricle from the right atrium through that tricuspid valve, like I talked about. Now, interesting thing about this tricuspid valve, it looks like flaps with strings hanging down to it, and these strings are attached to little muscle tabs. They're called papillary muscles. These strings are called chordae tendineae. They look like tendons and they look like cords, so they're called chordae tendineae. So remember chordae tendineae, and they're attached to the papillary muscles. So what happens is when the ventricle contracts to try to force the blood out, what happens, it also causes a contraction of these chordae tendineae, and the backflow of the blood against the tricuspid valve, and the contraction of chordae tendineae snap that tricuspid valve closed. okay? And therefore blood doesn't go from the right ventricle back into the right atrium. We don't want that to happen. Blood in the heart needs to go one direction and one direction only. When it does go the wrong direction, it creates abnormal sounds, and some of those abnormal sounds, one of them is called a murmur, okay? There are different types of murmurs, and sometimes when it goes the wrong way or through a hole, it's called, that's what we get, the sound, any kind of sound we get that's abnormal is called a murmur. One thing I should very briefly mention, that inside the heart are these things called trabecular cardiac, and it looks like ridges on the inside of the ventricle, inside of the muscle. So if I look at there, you can see these trabecular cardiac that are in there, but they're still covered with endocardium, so they're actually smooth. You can see there's the tricuspid valve, and what happens is once that right ventricle contracts, it's going to force blood in that direction of the arrow out through the thing that's sort of like a lilac color, and that's called the pulmonary artery. Now, pulmonary arteries, you think it has lots of oxygen. The pulmonary artery doesn't. It's come from the body where a lot of that oxygen's already been removed. So the right ventricle is going to pump the blood out through that pulmonary artery through another little valve that you see there. It's called the pulmonary valve. And that pulmonary valve will open when the ventricle contracts to let blood go out. But when the ventricle relaxes, it closes so blood doesn't go from the lungs back into the right side of the heart. That's what these valves do. So I have on the right side of the heart, I have the tricuspid valve, and then between the atria and the ventricle, and I have the pulmonary valve at the root of the pulmonary artery at the end of the right ventricle to prevent backflow. Okay. And there's my right ventricle. And you see where I'm sort of like, you see those chordae tendineae. You can see how it attaches those little things called papillary muscles, which contract to help to close the valve. The left atrium, okay? Now what happens is once the blood leaves the right ventricle, it goes to the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. In the lungs, it's going to get rid of the oxygen, and I'll talk about that when we talk about the pulmonary section later on. It gets rid of the oxygen, or it gets rid of the carbon dioxide, and it picks up oxygen. So now the carbon dioxide that's a waste product that's been picked up in the tissue gets to the lungs, and we get rid of it. We put it back. What happens is we take it from the blood, put it back in these air sacs so I can breathe it out. And the oxygen that's been in these air sacs in the air, which is only about 21% oxygen, the oxygen then could go into the vessels. Now we oxygenate the blood. Now the blood becomes more oxygenated, and it goes from there through pulmonary veins, and the pulmonary veins go back into the left atrium. They go into the left atrium, okay? So the blood connects from 4 pulmonary veins. There's 2 pulmonary veins on the left, 2 pulmonary veins on the right. And this one drains the right lung, this one drains the left lung, and they go back right into the area of the left atrium. The blood now, again, is oxygenated. We've gotten rid of the carbon dioxide in the lungs, and we've picked up oxygen, okay? Also, we know we have that auricular portion, that area that expands on the left atrium. And then what happens is when the left atrium fills, it's time for the left atrium to contract, and I'll talk about how that contraction occurs down the road in a couple lectures down from this. What happens is now the left atrium muscles will squeeze. That valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle will open. We know that's called the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve, and allows blood to go back in, goes down into the area of the left ventricle. Okay, so that's what we have that. So let's look at the area of my left atrium. There's my left atrium up in there. Blood's coming back, and you can see the pulmonary veins coming in from the right side of that image. You can see the pulmonary veins on the left, but they're behind all the other vessels. They're behind the superior vena cava, and they're behind that other thing called the aorta, which we'll talk about, and behind the pulmonary artery, which is that lilac colored thing that you see in the image. And so we have 2 from the right, 2 from the left that come in, 2 little holes, and they enter into the left atrium. And now the blood gets back from the lungs, now with good oxygen, got rid of the carbon dioxide in the right atrium. And then what's going to happen, the right atrium is going to contract, force the blood down through that valve, that bicuspid valve or mitral valve, into the left ventricle. So let's talk a little about the left ventricle. Now the blood gets in the left ventricle. Now we talked about how that left ventricle is big, okay? It has the muscle walls are really thicker than the right ventricle. Again, because we have to develop enough pressure to send the blood a longer distance. If I measure the pressure in the lungs, it's minuscule as compared to the blood pressure I measure in the arm, which might be, during the pumping pressure time, it might be 120, 130, 140 millimeters of mercury pressure, because I have to pump that blood a long way. So to develop the pressure, the muscles in the left ventricle have to be thicker, okay? Otherwise, the majority of the other structure of the left ventricle is very similar. The valve, even though it only has 2 leaflets, mitral valve, bicuspid valve, has the same chordae tendineae and the same papillary muscles. And the inside lining of that left ventricle has those trabecular cardiac, okay, which are basically these lumpy, bumpy areas out through there. And so it looks very much similar to the right ventricle, except the muscle walls are thicker. I have a 2-leaflet valve, bicuspid as compared to tricuspid. What happens is when now the left ventricle contracts, it forces that blood out through another valve called the aortic valve. And it goes out and pushes it into the aorta. Okay, so the blood now is leaving the left ventricle and pushed out to the aorta. When the left ventricle contracts, because of the contraction and the pressure of the blood, it closes the mitral valve as well as the firing of those papillary muscles that bring those chordae tendinae together and snap close the valve, so blood doesn't go from the left ventricle back up into the left atrium. This is a common problem when that valve doesn't close. It's called mitral insufficiency. It's an exceptionally common problem, and it does cause a significant problem. It's a big cause of heart failure down the road. We won't talk about that now. Maybe if we have time later on, we will. Okay. So now when the left ventricle contracts, the bicuspid mitral valve closes. Blood goes out through what's called the aortic valve. The aortic valve will open. Okay, will open up to let the blood go out, and then when the ventricle stops contracting, when the left ventricle stops contracting, to prevent the blood from coming back into the left ventricle, that aortic valve will close. Now, interesting thing about the aorta, at the root of the aorta, right where the aorta starts, just above where that valve is, it's wide. Okay, and that's called the aortic sinus, And the reason why it's wide is on both sides of it, there's 2 little holes. There's a hole on the right side and a hole on the left side. The right side is going to go to the right coronary artery, and the left side goes to the left coronary artery. So when the blood goes out the aorta, it goes past these holes and fills the coronary arteries. But then when the ventricle stops contracting and the aortic valve stops, we have a little bit of a backflow towards the valve, and that forces more blood out the coronary arteries. So the coronary arteries actually get 2 pumps of circulation for every pump of the heart. Okay, so it's very economical when that happens. Okay, so this is basically, let's look at the left ventricle. You can see the left ventricle. You can see it. You can see it on the right side of the screen. It says left ventricle. You can see the chordae tendinae. You can see the bicuspid valve. And then what happens? You can't see the aortic valve. It's tucked up in behind, right behind that pulmonary valve. Okay, behind the pulmonary artery. But you can see the aorta as it swings over the top. When the aorta comes out of the left ventricle, it's actually going upwards and forwards. Then it goes into what's called the aortic arch, which is at the top. At that point, it starts to swing backwards and to the left. And finally, when you get down behind it at the very end, where it's going behind the area of the pulmonary artery, it's actually very close to the chest wall, and then it eventually gets fused to the back side of the chest wall, just to the left side of the vertebrae. And it runs all the way down there, all the way to the diaphragm, and goes through a little archway in the diaphragm to be able to get into the abdomen. We'll talk about that later on. So anyway, that's the left ventricle, and you can't see you can't see the aortic valve. It's tucked up in there behind there, but that's where it's at. So there's my left ventricle right there. You can actually follow those arrows, which show the direction of blood flow. Okay, the aorta. Okay, the aorta is the large artery that leaves the left side of the heart. It's probably about the size of my index finger. It's a good size artery. And again, when it leaves the heart, at the base of the heart from the left ventricle, it goes up and forward, and then it gets to the top, and when it gets to the top, it goes this arch. It goes posteriorly, goes towards the back and a little bit to the left, and then finally gets over the end of the arch, and it goes downwards, just sitting to a little bit to the left of the vertebrae, where it's stuck back there. It doesn't move. The aorta, once it gets to the back wall of the abdomen, or back wall of the chest, it's stuck back there. Okay, the area of the aorta basically is the ascending portion is right where the coronary arteries, and I'll show you exactly where the coronary arteries come out from that aortic sinus. But when I get to the top of that aortic arch, there are 3 little branches that come out of that. We'll talk more about those branches later on. Okay, we have 3 little branches that will come out of the top. I'll talk about that more in lab. 3 little branches. The first little branch that we get to is called the brachiocephalic artery. I'll talk about that more in lab. And that brachiocephalic artery starts to swing to the right, and then it divides. When it divides, it goes into the right common carotid, which goes up the right side of my neck. And it goes to the right subclavian artery, which goes to my right arm. The second branch off the top actually goes directly as the left common carotid. So it comes up and goes to the left side of the neck to supply the head, the neck, the brain, and stuff like that. The third branch is the left subclavian that goes to the left arm, and that's the area of the aortic arch. Once I get past that arch, I go to the back, and that's called the descending artery, descending aorta. One also interesting thing about the aortic arch. Okay, and the image doesn't show it, but on the bottom surface of the aortic arch, it's really close. It actually goes right over the top of the pulmonary artery. Well, between the pulmonary artery on the top and the area of the aortic arch, there's also a little channel. There's a small little tube, okay, and that area is called the ductus. Ductus means a duct, like a air duct or something like that, called the ductus arteriosum. We talked about how that foraminal valley sort of limits the amount of blood that has to go to the lung because that's a wasted tour. But if I get the blood that goes out the pulmonary artery as well, what happens is part of it can actually go up that ductus arteriosum and into the aorta, so it can go to the rest of the body. Another way to divert blood flow that goes to the lungs, okay? And that's called that. After birth, what will happen is that ductus arteriosus will close off shortly after birth, and actually anatomically, when they look at a cadaver, you'll actually see it because there's a very important nerve that swings around that part. A branch of the vagus nerve actually swings right around the aorta, comes down and swings underneath the aorta and goes back up to the larynx, or the vocal cords. It goes underneath the aorta to go back up to the neck. Strange, but what happens, it's called a recurrent laryngeal nerve. What happens is it's right where that ligamentum arteriosum is. That ligamentum arteriosum is where that ductus arteriosus closed. It's sort of like solidified. It's like a tab that connects the two, and that's what we see with the aorta. Now, if we look at the aorta receiver, actually it does show a little bit here. I'm sorry. So what happens is if we look at that aortic arch, okay, you can see a little tab. It says the ligamentum arteriosum. And that would be open normally in a fetus, not after birth, but in a fetus. So blood that's coming out of the left ventricle, out of the right ventricle to go to the lungs, if it hasn't gone through the foraminal valley from the right atrium to the left atrium, it comes out through the right ventricle. Some of that blood will go through that little ductus arteriosus into the area of the aortic arch. So therefore, it further bypasses the lungs. And then after birth, that closes and it remains as a little tab that's right there. You can't see it right here, but right behind the area of the pulmonary valve, there'll be a hole on the right side and a hole on the left side, and that's where the coronary arteries come out. The right coronary artery to the right side, and the left coronary artery to the left side. Okay, so anyway, that's what I see here. And there's the aorta with a big star on the top. It's a huge thing. I could talk more about the aorta, but we don't have enough time to talk about that. Sometimes people, when they have, if I see sometimes like a young kid who's like who's excessively tall, you know, a basketball player, and all of a sudden you see, and you get a thing and see in the newspaper or in the news, or somewhat on the internet, 16-year-old high school basketball phenom dies on the court. And sometimes it's because they have what's called Marfan syndrome. And Marfan syndrome is a connective tissue disorder. And sometimes the tissue of the aorta is too weak, and sometimes it just blows out. Or it may cause conduction problems to the heart, and they end up with an abnormal heart rate, which causes them to die. So anyway, there's a lot that we could talk about the aorta, but we don't have enough time to talk about it right now. Valves. Again, those valves are important because they only allowed one-way flow. Okay, we don't want backflow to go to there. So we know we have our atrioventricular valves, which are my tricuspid valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and my bicuspid valve, which is between the left atrium and the left ventricle, and the bicuspid is also known as the mitral valve. What happens is, again, we talked about how they're attached in the ventricle by these chordae tendineae and these little papillary muscles. They help them to close and stuff like that, and that's what allows those valves to close. The valves at the base of the aorta and the base of the pulmonary artery are called semilunar valves, and they're small little they're little leaflets. They don't really have a muscular attachment to them. There's no real no muscular support. There's no papillary muscles, but they're just little leaflets. So when that valve opens, it goes like that. You see it actually sort of like wiggles and closes back, wiggles and closes back, and it seals shut. It does a good job at that. They're called semilunar valves, and that's my aortic valve and my pulmonary valve, right at the base of the pulmonary artery and right at the base of the aorta. Okay, again, sometimes we have problems with these valves, such as a stenosis. Stenosis means that the valves get tight and they get hard, they're connected, and they don't open right, and as a result it causes a restriction of flow out of that valve. In other words, the ventricle is pumping, but if it has to pump through a smaller hole, it actually makes more of a jet coming out of it, and you hear a like shooting sound, like an injection sound. We also have a valve that doesn't close, and when a valve doesn't close, it's called either incompetent or regurgitant. And regurgitant means the blood flows back, and we get a murmur because of that. Okay, instead of that stenotic murmur, that in a regurgitant murmur, it sounds more like more like a blowing murmur. And these are sounds you can hear when you auscultate or listen to the chest when you find these abnormal valves. And again, here are the valves. We see all the valves here. I'm going to outline them for you where they are. You know, there's my tricuspid valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle. There's my bicuspid mitral valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle. There's the pulmonary valve from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery, and then deep down inside there, underneath there, would be my aortic valve from the left ventricle to the aorta. Okay, and this is what the valves look like, open and closed. The one on the upper left shows that what happens is that's my atrioventricular valve, open. Okay, and then the semilunar valves, you can see the aortic and the pulmonary valve, they're closed, and they both aren't open at the same time. When the aortic valve or when the semilunar valves are open, they're allowing the ventricle to fill. I don't want blood to leave the ventricle until I get it filled. Finally, when the ventricle is filled, the atrioventricular valves close, the semilunar valves open and allow blood to be ejected. At that time, the atria are filling. Okay, we'll talk more about that cycle. And so the bottom picture shows where the semilunar valves are open at the bottom and the atrioventricular valves are closed. Okay. Coronary arteries. I just want to mention a couple things about the coronary arteries, and we could probably spend about 3 hours just talking about the coronary arteries. The thing about it is the blood supply that runs through those chambers of the heart, the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle, do not supply nutrients to the heart muscle itself. The heart muscle needs its own blood supply, and it gets its own blood supply by what we call the coronary arteries, which is basically a right coronary artery and left coronary artery with multiple branches. So the coronary arteries provide the blood supply and provide nutrients and oxygen to the myocardium, so the myocardium can do its work. Okay, they arise right where the aorta starts. You couldn't see it on those last images because it's right behind that pulmonary artery. Sits right behind there. There's a hole on the right side, there's a hole on the left side, and it's a area of very high pressure. That way what happens, the pressure in the aorta at that point allows blood to go out there to provide a nice blood supply to the area of the heart. Okay, and again, with ventricular contraction, blood's forced from the left ventricle and the aorta, some of it goes out, but when the aortic valve closes after all the blood's pumped out, because the aorta is elastic, it stretches. When it recoils back, most of the blood's going to go forward, but some of it will go back towards the aortic valve and forces it out through the coronary arteries again. So they get that double circulation like I talked about before, which is sort of a cool mechanical thing. The right coronary artery is basically follows along the coronary sulcus, which is that groove between the atrium and the ventricles, from the right side of the aorta around to the back side of the heart. And it supplies blood to the right atrium, part of both ventricles, and the conducting system, which is really important. We'll talk more about the conducting system, certain areas where the heartbeat originates, or which really controls the heartbeat, called the SA and the AV node. Hold on to that for now. We'll talk about it later. When it gets to the back, it sends a branch straight down the back to the apex of the heart, right down the back through a little groove between the right ventricle and the left ventricle in the posterior aspect of the heart. And that's what the right coronary artery does. Okay, and basically you can see it right here a little bit. The blue is the vein, but if you look underneath there, the red is the right coronary artery. So the right coronary artery starts at the aorta, you can't see it here, and swings around to the back of the heart. And then what happens is from that point you can see how it sits down between the left ventricle and the right ventricle. Okay, and this is called the posterior interventricular artery. You can see a little annotation there that shows that artery that goes down towards the apex. The right coronary artery then continues a little bit more towards the left, where basically what it does, it creates what's called a functional anastomosis. The right coronary artery doesn't actually join up so much with the left coronary artery, but it intermingles. So that area gets supply from where they cross over, gets supply from both the right coronary artery from here and the left coronary artery from there. So that's the right coronary artery. The left coronary artery is a little bit more adventurous. Okay, the left coronary artery basically starts has two main branches. The left coronary artery per se is only about maybe an inch long, and when it comes off the aorta, it goes underneath the pulmonary artery. Once that left coronary artery gets out from underneath the pulmonary artery, one branch continues around in that coronary sulcus around to the back, where it's going to meet with that right coronary artery in the back. The other part comes right down the front, which is called the left anterior descending or left anterior interventricular artery that comes down the front. These muscles are important because they really supply a good portion of the heart. The anterior, the interventricular sulcus, and a good portion of the heart are supplied by by the left coronary artery. And again, then it's funny because the right posterior interventricular artery comes down the back between the right ventricle and left ventricle, and the left anterior interventricular artery comes down the front, and basically they also create that functional anastomosis underneath the apex of the heart where the branches sort of come together. Okay, so that's called the left coronary artery. And again, we can see the left coronary artery here. They've actually taken the pulmonary artery off. See that hole? That hole would be where the pulmonary trunk is, where the pulmonary artery comes off. And you can see where the right coronary artery comes underneath that little auricle of the our right atrium. But you can see where that left coronary artery comes, and it's going to go between the area of the pulmonary vein behind and the pulmonary artery in front. It goes, and finally when it gets past the pulmonary artery, you see it just a little bit to the right of where that hole would be. Part of it goes down, and that's my anterior interventricular or left anterior descending artery that goes down the front. The rest of it goes around to the back. When it goes around to the back, that part of the left coronary artery is called the circumflex artery that goes around to the back. It's called the circumflex artery. Okay, and that's what we say. Now, I personally know this person really well because it's me, okay? And a long time ago in 1987, I had a heart attack, okay? And what happened was there were some problems, but everything was okay. It was managed by medication for a long time. And then finally in about 2000, I started to have some shortness of breath when I was running, because I was running about 35-40 miles a week. I was starting to get some shortness of breath when I was running. So I went back to my cardiologist, and they did a cardiac cath. And when they did the cardiac cath, what they did, if you look at the two, this is what they do: is they take a vessel, they take a tube and put it in your femoral artery, okay, in the top of your leg, and pass this tube up through the aorta backwards, okay, all the way up through that aortic arch, and they stick it right where the aorta starts. And what's there? The openings of the coronary arteries. They take that tube and stick it right where the opening of the coronary artery is, put a little dye, and the dye outlines where this is going. Okay, and if you look at if you look on the left side of this, there's two. There's a artery that comes off and it branches into two that sort of go parallel to each other. If you look about halfway down the one of the two of them that's on the right, okay, about halfway down, there's a little area of narrowing, and that's where the problem was. That's where the problem was, okay? So what they did at that point is, you can see it better here. Now, if you look, see that little knob, see that straight tube? That's the catheter coming up from my leg. It goes through the aortic arch. You can see actually swinging around. And that knob that you see that looks like a little knob at the end of a rod there, that's the end. That's the aortic sinus. That's where the aortic the openings for the coronary arteries are. So what they've done is they put the tube, that catheter, in that area of that corner of where the coronary artery comes, and they injected the dye. Now you could easily see it. Okay, if you look at where those two divide, probably about short way down, you see where that artery narrows, and that's where the problem was. So what they decided was, because I had this, I was getting short of breath. What they did was in 2000. Okay, what they decided to do was have another tube that went inside there with a little balloon right where that narrowing is. They stuck that tube with the balloon in there. They blew up the balloon, which expanded the artery, the coronary artery, and reestablished blood flow. They also had a wire cage around that balloon, so when they blew up the balloon, they blew up the wire cage. Then they deflate the balloon, and the cage holds the artery open. So that was before they did it. You can see where it is, and there's afterwards. You can't see it anymore. In other words, we see when they divide, it's open. So what happens is that's where they open. It's called an angioplasty and a stent. So if you see somebody had a coronary artery angioplasty or percutaneous, it says PTCA, percutaneous transluminal across the lumen, which means the tube, coronary, which means heart, angioplasty, angiovesoplasty, surgical repair. That's what they did. So if I compare those two side by side, the one on the left was before, you can see where it's narrowed, and the one on the right, where just after where it bifurcates or divides, it's open, and that's a coronary angioplasty. Okay, percutaneous coronary transluminal coronary angioplasty. That's what I want to talk in regards to the particular anatomy of the heart. Okay, I'm going to be putting another video up relatively shortly. Okay, now that you know the anatomy, you know the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle, valves, what they're doing, the circuits and stuff like that. All this stuff is really important. It's going to help you to build a basis as to where we go from here. The next thing we're going to talk about in my next video is going to be how things work. Okay, what's called the conducting system. How is this electrical signal sent throughout the heart? How do we make the heart do what it needs to do? What do the cells do, and how does this happen? And I'll be talking about that in an upcoming video. So hopefully you got some questions about this, and hopefully you learned a little bit more, and hopefully it was informative. And again, if you follow your PowerPoints, the couple of slides it actually skipped forward. I don't know why, but I can't go back for some reason. When I do this, I can't go back. But you can actually see those on your PowerPoints, which are there for the whole year. So if you, again, when you view this, if you have any questions, by all means, either let me know, and I'll be able to be more than happy to answer those.